My name is Colleen Dell, and I'm a professor at the University of Saskatchewan, and I hold the chair in One Health and Wellness. I'm located here in Saskatoon, the homeland of the Métis and Treaty 6 territory. I'm a lead researcher on a Health Canada substance use and addiction project. We're examining the role of service dogs like EJ here in supporting veterans diagnosed with PTSD and who problematically use substances. So we have a team made up of researchers, veterans with lived and living experience, service dog providers, clinicians, and of course, service dogs themselves like EJ here, who's in training, who I put cookies up here so you pay attention, but not sure that was the best idea. Our team is really pleased to offer this webinar on moral injury today with one of our project partners for this study, the Center of Excellence on PTSD and other related mental health conditions. So today, our guests from the center are going to, our guests from the center are going to provide an introduction to moral injury, how to recognize it, so some practice, and offer best practices as well on how to support veterans who may be dealing with it. This is a really timely topic because there's discussion about moral injury right now in our healthcare centers, in our system with the current pandemic. We saw examples of this earlier in the year in Italy on who gets treatments, right? And we see stuff going on in Texas, for example, and lots of other places right now. So this is very timely for more than one reason. So given the topic of our presentation today, I just want to make everyone really aware that we're going to be discussing potentially traumatic events that occurred during military operations, and then with elements of sexual violence as well. There will not be any specific details shared, but I just want to make sure that you're aware of that, so if that is problematic for some attendees. You see some crisis support numbers here and email addresses that are on the slide or on the screen. And these slides will be available right after our presentation at servicedogresearch.ca, as well as the webinar, the recording as well. And I'm also just going to let you know that we're going to send out a really 3-question evaluation afterwards if you can help us out with that. So I'm really honored today to introduce each of our speakers, and I want to get a bit of a bio about each because you're going to understand, how lucky and fortunate we are to have Patrick, Brian, and Stephanie with us today. So Dr. Patrick Smith is the president and CEO of the Center of Excellence on PTSD. He brings over 25 years of experience leading clinical and research programs related to mental health and addictions, including his most recent post as the National Chief Executive Officer of the Canadian Mental Health Association. He has a PhD in clinical and community psychology, and he has held senior positions with the BC Mental Health and Addiction Services, Renaissance Fellowship and Foundation, and the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. So Patrick is going to be providing the overview of moral injury. Next, we're going to have Brian McKenna speaking, and he is a strategic advisor at the center. He joined the Canadian Forces in 1995 as an infantryman and served for 19 years before being released due to injuries. In 2000, Brian deployed to Bosnia as part of a peacekeeping forces sent to stabilize the former Yugoslavia, and he subsequently deployed to Bosnia a second time in 2003, then later to Afghanistan in 2011, and again in 2012. Brian is going to be providing us a lived experience perspective on moral injury as a veteran of the Canadian Armed Forces. So we're very, very thankful to you, Brian. And Stephanie Houle is a research associate at the center. She's currently completing her PhD in clinical psychology at the University of Ottawa, focusing on moral injury. She completed part of her clinical training at National Defense. She's a member of the Moral Injury Outcome Study Consortium, which is an international group of researchers working to develop a validated measure of moral injury, which is super exciting. Stephanie will speak to her experiences conducting research and also clinical interviews related to moral injury. So bring it back down to practice for a lot of our participants and attendees today. I also want to acknowledge the work of Ashley Mulligan and Fardis Hassani at the center, and then with Mary Ellen Gibson in my own office at the University of Saskatchewan, for helping to organize this. Like with everything, there's a lot of work that goes into it. So I just want to start here, one more slide from me, and tell you a little bit about the center. It was funded by Veteran Affairs Canada, and it was established in 2019, so really new. And the aim is to provide better access to information, research, tools, and expertise on PTSD and related mental health problems and illnesses. The center's goal is to create knowledge networks with researchers, service providers, veterans, and their families from across Canada, and to increase expertise on military and veteran mental health, suicide prevention, and substance use disorders. The center will be creating new knowledge on veteran mental health treatments and place these directly into the hands of mental health professionals and others working with veterans on a daily basis. Such an important gap that the center is filling. The center aims to share evidence-based treatment protocols and best practices among the Veteran Affairs Canada network of operational stress injury clinics, the Canadian Forces Health Services, and with mental health professionals across the country, like many who are on our webinar today. It's anticipated that the first responders, their families, and other Canadians living with and affected by PTSD or related mental health problems will also benefit from information and knowledge developed at the center. I'd like to also mention that I understand the center is going to be releasing a call for reference group members soon, and that includes veterans, their families, service providers, researchers, so probably everybody who is somehow an attendee today. So you can follow their Twitter and LinkedIn channels to learn more about this opportunity. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Patrick Smith.
Thank you, Dr. Dell. And before I get started speaking about moral injury today, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the land where I'm presenting from, Stratford, Ontario. Stratford is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Ojibwe, and Chippewa peoples, and this territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge our Centre of Excellence for PTSD, funded by Veterans Affairs Canada, is just over 1 year old. But for the first 6 months, it was just me. When someone asked me, actually a partner of a friend of mine asked us, so what makes it a Center of Excellence? And it's important for me to acknowledge that the Center of Excellence is not something that started and was acknowledged by the experts saying that that place over there is a Center of Excellence. It's aspirational. It's that the Government of Canada decided that veterans who have served their country and their family members deserve a Center of Excellence, a Center of Excellence that can help to better understand their needs and respond to their needs. And so it's aspirational, and that's how we're building this Center of Excellence. And because of that, we want to really ensure that we're focusing on various forms of knowledge and ways of knowing. And so we're always looking at it from a veteran-centric perspective and a family member-centric perspective, because we know that there's research evidence, we know that there's Indigenous ways of knowing, and we can't help but see the overlap for the Thunderbird Partnership First Nations Wellness Framework in the focus of hope, purpose, meaning, and belonging being an underpinning for some of the work that we're doing. We're always looking through all of our ways of knowing through the eyes and ears of veterans and their families. And that's why today we're going to be talking about some of the research information, what we know so far, what we don't know. But we're also going to be hearing from retired warrant officer Ryan McKenna about his personal experience. It's also important for me to recognize Stephanie Houle. Steph is on her way to being Dr. Houle, and she's been one of the leading moral injury researchers in Canada, and I want to thank her for pulling together the slides on the research and everything. So I want you to know that I'm going to be taking and talking about moral injury from a 30,000 feet perspective, from what we know so far. What do we know from the literature? Our Center of Excellence is always going to be looking at the Venn diagram overlap on what the research literature says, what we hear from veteran stakeholders and their families, and the experiences of healthcare workers and clinicians working day to day with veterans. And so what I'm hoping is that after this webinar, what you'll take away from it is a better understanding of how to appreciate this construct, how to appreciate and recognize veterans who may be experiencing it, and then how best to address that. So the first thing is, what is moral injury? It's a construct that not everyone is familiar with. And unfortunately, it's been defined many different ways. The truth is, we're still trying to understand what moral injury is. But you know what? From my perspective, talking to family members who've had it, who've had moral injury as a result of their service in military, and some who've had it, who they feel like they've resolved it, and others that are still, they would say, haunted by it. If you listen to veterans, if you listen to family members, they will tell you that you'll know it when you see it. There's been a lot of debate about whether or not our classic PTSD already includes moral injury, and we don't need a separate diagnostic category. Most of the veterans and family members I've spoken to really believe that the more classical approach of understanding PTSD really doesn't capture sometimes what they experience for moral injury. So, before I drill down, there are a few concepts that I want to talk about that might help to frame the discussion. So, again, some researchers say that moral injury is not separate from PTSD and is covered within it. Others say moral injury may be a subtype of PTSD. So whichever it is, whether it's a separate syndrome or subtypes, I want to kind of talk about the differences. We're going to be drilling down and unpacking that a bit more, but just to frame it from the beginning. Some people can understand the more traditional fear and anxiety-based PTSD that is often combat stress related. I'm going to give you really stark examples of how the differences can play out. So a serving member comes home after serving in military, is walking through the kitchen, and his wife is making a smoothie, turns on the blender. And the service member, the veteran, immediately takes cover under the dining room table. It's a visceral response, it's a hypervigilance, and it's very much what we would say is on the fear and anxiety circuitry. So it's something that is visceral, it's immediate, and it's a reaction. Someone with moral injury describes that they may not have any fear and anxiety-based issue, but imagine a senior leader in a peacekeeping mission. That senior leader is following the rules of engagement, which is not engage. Every week, a mother brings a child shot with shrapnel to the gates and asks for service and for help. The members of those manning the gates call up, and they have to confirm that they cannot open the gates. 6 months later, that person is haunted with the nightmare of how many kids they could have helped if they were able to have different rules of engagement. Not a fear and anxiety base, but a guilt and shame base. So I think it's also important to recognize that it's not always that clean cut. And so for many veterans, they tell us that they may have neither after serving. They may have just fear and anxiety-based PTSD. They may have just guilt and shame-based moral injury, or they may have both. And so it's important to acknowledge that it's not really clear that it's either one or the other. In fact, it's pretty clear that it's not one or the other. So the four most common definitions, the ones that are quoted the most, are these. And it started with psychiatrist Jonathan Shea in the US talking about a betrayal of what's right by someone who holds legitimate authority or high-stakes situation. Dr. Brett Litz and others added to that and talked about the lasting psychological, biological, spiritual, behavioral, and social impacts. And it transgressions of deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. For Brock and Latini, talked about a wound in the soul and an inner conflict, and really talked more about the psycho-spiritual component. And I think Jinkerson in 2016 really tried to equate it to PTSD. So just as we know that not everyone who experiences traumatic events ends up with full-blown PTSD, it's the same that not everyone who experiences morally injurious experiences is going to end up with a syndrome of moral injury. And so for the purposes of the way I'm going to be talking about this, and I think that we're going to be talking about it, we're going to differentiate between experiences. And when we talk about moral injury, we are really talking about the functional impairment that you would expect with other fear and anxiety-based PTSD. So it describes the psycho-spiritual consequences of events that seriously violate one's moral beliefs and expectations. And so for the purposes of this, of our study, and the field is talking about potentially morally injurious events. So again, not every experience of a potentially morally injurious event leads to moral injury. So to kind of unpack that a bit, what are some of the potentially morally injurious events? That can be direct or indirect. It can be just witnessing of acts that violate moral beliefs, or it could be you're taking part in it yourself. It can be expected or unexpected, and includes both acts of commission, what you've done, and acts of omission. And that acts of omission is what you personally couldn't do, or what someone else couldn't do. And we'll be hearing from Brian later, but I often quote him because he talks about sometimes the moral injury, the injury itself, is what you couldn't do, not what you could. And he'll describe that a bit. And the violation, could be perceived in the moment while the person's experiencing it. They could be struggling, or it could be after the fact, like I mentioned about the example of the senior leader that 6 months later is haunted by nightmares. One of the things that we find most important when we're working with PTSD or moral injury is to not pathologize this. These are natural, normal reactions to abnormal, unprecedented stimuli and experiences. And that's really important when we're working with veterans and serving military. We're not talking about something that is aberrant. We're talking about natural experiences. But those natural responses can be, if not addressed, can actually lead to functional impairment. Every time we talk to new veterans, they tell us more about what are these potentially morally injurious events. Just like with healthcare workers, we think about the easy ones to understand is in Italy, where the physicians were complaining about having 10 patients that all needed ventilators and having 3 ventilators and having to make the tough choice of which patient is more likely to benefit from the ventilator. Those kind of Sophie's choices are clear. But what we hear from healthcare workers, it's the more subtle things that are a lot more important to address, because they're not even the ones that they're aware of at the time. So it's to give an example, in the healthcare environment, we had a respiratory therapist that said, in the face of not knowing what to do with this virus, there's no blueprint. There's a lot of trial and error, and so. One of her patients was not getting enough oxygen, so she rolled him on his stomach, and it increased his oxygenation pretty rapidly. So she felt good. The next time she had a similar situation, she rolled the patient onto their stomach, and they coded. And what's important for us when we're talking about these experiences is if that's where that ended, and that was one-off, that would be a troubling, kind of morally injurious experience. But if that's happening over and over and over, and if you aren't aware that others are experiencing the same thing, it can lead to more functional impairment. So I think that, the first, really understanding this from a research perspective, and Stephanie's going to be able to go into more of the details, having been researching this moral injury among military and veteran population. But this first statistic, the 49 to 84% report exposure to atrocities or massacres, that's from a pre-Afghanistan review in statistics and a survey. And the second, 56% reporting exposure to any potentially morally injurious event, including these examples that you see here. That comes from in 2013 post-Afghanistan. So the reality is experiencing these traumatic events are not rare. And so how do we support individuals through them? And it's important for us to understand that there are multiple outcomes that can come from experiencing these different traumatic events. By and large, you can, the potential morally injurious events can be categorized as from the individual's perspective that they take personal responsibility for, they've done something, or they haven't been able to do something, or the responsibility of others. And I think it's important to point out that it's either that they're involved in it and they've done something so that they have guilt and shame for themselves. They may have witnessed others and not been able to prevent what others are doing, or it may be more systemic, as you see under the responsibility of others at the bottom. The betrayal by symptoms is very important, and some are saying maybe its own category. This could be a layering of trauma. So I'll give you an example. In military sexual trauma, there's an experience that someone has experienced sexual assault in the military. That in and of itself is a traumatic event, and there may be longer-term functional impairment based on experiencing that trauma. But what we also know is how the direct leader, the peers, and the overall response from those in charge, how they respond to that sexual assault has everything to do with whether an individual feels like they should and can disclose, whether they feel supported, and the way others respond can be a layering of trauma that many tell us is worse than the original trauma itself. That's the same with PTSD. How, if you're experiencing, if a soldier is experiencing traumatic events and some of the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, how that is responded to by their peers, by their supervisor, and by the military has everything to do with whether or not that's going to either exacerbate, their response can exacerbate or mitigate what the long-term impact is. The results of a qualitative study conducted among U.S. male veterans serving in operations related to global war on terror, so mostly Iraq and Afghanistan, they found that the experiences were could be categorized in these four areas: organizational, environmental, psychological, cultural, relational. These slides will be available to you, so I won't go into all of these, but I'm going to unpack just a couple of these. So as I mentioned, if the rules of engagement are restrictive, inconvenient, or hard to define, that could be a challenge. If there's a leadership incompetence, a feeling like people are out of touch, self-serving, or uncaring. And again, to unpack that again with healthcare workers experiencing potentially morally injurious events. Nurses going into ICU units working with COVID patients, for example, if they feel like their leadership is behind them, understands what they're dealing with, and is supporting them, it's a completely different experience than if leadership is incompetent, out of touch, self-serving, or uncaring. So these contextual organizational factors are quite important. And environmental, it could be enemies' tactical strategies. We know that the increased urbanization of war can have an impact. Dealing with poverty in difficult geographic conditions, so there are environmental factors. Psychological, the result could be a feeling of hopelessness and resolution to return home. Emotional detachment or fear or helplessness. And cultural relational. It could actually lead to a significant lack of trust, perceived incompetence of comrades, dehumanization of the enemy, or hateful attitudes towards the civilians. So again, we talked about moral stress amongst healthcare workers during COVID-19. What we know is everything that we've researched and that we've understood from the experience of serving military and veterans about their experience of potentially morally injurious events and how that can translate into a more functionally impaired moral injury syndrome, if you will, has been rapidly applied to the healthcare context. And you can't look on any listserv these days without looking at the mental health impacts of healthcare workers and other essential workers like grocery clerks. They're constantly having challenges and moral stressors on a daily basis. Will they all have moral injury at the end of COVID? No. And a big part of what we're saying is how we support these healthcare workers, these essential workers during this time, focusing on those organizational and environmental things can actually have a huge impact. One of the nurses told me one of the worst parts for her is it speaks to rules of engagement. They were following all the rules. There were all kinds of reasons why they knew you couldn't have family members visiting COVID patients. But it's another thing altogether to be in complete kind of space uniform, as she called it, geared up with all of her personal protective equipment, holding a cell phone to a family's ear so that a family member could say goodbye. That's going to be something that's going to be, as she says, haunting her for a while. But to know that she's not alone and to know that others, and having the opportunity to debrief that and talk about that has a huge impact on how she metabolizes that experience. Now, this is a continuum of moral stress and distress, and I think what's most important about this is, like we said, there are all kinds of moral challenges. On the left-hand side, it would be that the stress itself would be low, and you would see it happening a lot. There are all kinds of moral challenges that are happening for serving military when they're in theater, and for healthcare workers when they're in this COVID-19 context, and then all the way through to much more serious morally injurious events that may not happen as often, but will have the same impact. So you could have the progression from moral frustration to distress to injury by having tons of moral challenges that are unresolved, that become stressors, that end up with moral injury. So it's more and more and more of the more subtle stressors. Or you could have very significant morally injurious events, and just a few of them that can lead to the same level of more severe and extreme moral injury. So when we look from moral pain to moral injury, to, again, there are the experiences, and not every experience leads to the syndrome of moral injury. But so the situation isn't often in high stakes environment, and like I said, could also be a cumulative effect of many, many, many moral challenges. The experience of more moral emotions, guilt, and shame that can actually, and self-condemnation that can actually be in response to the moral injury, and then finally the expanded impact that it has on someone, so that when they're not able to, as one family member of mine said, make peace with their moral challenges. So we've talked about this being very much on the guilt and shame-based circuitry. And I think this is an important thing that I've heard from veterans and family members, so that if a clinician or researcher doesn't believe in moral injury, let's say, and is doing more of the traditional fear and anxiety-based treatments, go back to the person who is having nightmares about all the kids that he could have perhaps helped or saved. Something like a prolonged exposure is an evidence-based treatment that helps someone learn that when they hear the blender, they don't have to take cover under the dining room table. And it's a way of taking the meaning out, if you will, out of that stimulus. But someone having prolonged exposure to go over and over and over the decisions may not be the best way of dealing with that inner conflict. We're also hearing from some Canadian researchers, preliminary research, that we may be able to even identify different neurobiological underpinnings of a fear and anxiety-based PTSD or a guilt and shame-based PTSD. And the way one person, the researcher said, is it's like the guilt and shame base, it's like in your gut. It's like it's tearing you apart in your gut. And so it actually mimics the way people talk about this moral injury. Again, it's just self-transgressions associated. It can be numbness, sadness, it can be a lot of not even seeing things as clearly in hindsight. And often can be a lot of self-blame. When it's other transgressions and betrayal-based events, it can also be associated with anger, and it may be a combination. If someone has felt like they had the ability, if they had acted to prevent or stop something, they may see it as a self-transgression and an other transgression. What we know quite clearly is that anger is very associated with the more general betrayal of the system, if you will. And anecdotally, what we're hearing from healthcare workers is that is the experience we're hearing from healthcare workers. They might feel frustrated that they're not able to do everything they need to do, but when they're going in there and not feeling like they have the support of their organization, maybe not feel like they have the right protective gear, as many have encountered, or they don't have an organization that understands what they're going through, it can be associated with high rates of anger. But I just want to talk about why is it important really to understand moral injury. And one of the reasons is because the rates among military personnel and veterans have increased, the rates of suicide in Canada and in the US since missions to Afghanistan and Iraq. And we do know that potentially morally injurious events and the exposure can be and has been in the research associated with suicidality. And we know clinically, and when we talk to veterans and families, that it can be also related to suicidal ideation. And the severity of moral injury distress obviously is associated with the history of suicidality, regardless of the PTSD severity. And the established risk factors that we know for suicide are all very much an overlap to the experience, the symptoms that we see with serious moral injury. Moral injury versus PTSD. So the way I like to say this is think about the guilt and shame-based moral injury, which may, in the end of the day, come out as a subtype of PTSD, versus the more traditional fear and anxiety-based PTSD. The reason I say that is because there's a strong constituent of clinicians and researchers who believe that when PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, as a syndrome really got its start, it was mostly in relation to childhood, sexual abuse. And from those early days, fear and anxiety were definitely part of it, but so were guilt and shame. And so what has happened is, as we've had more evidence-based treatments and really a focus on the fear and anxiety, especially as it relates to combat operational stressors, we've had less focus on the guilt and shame. And so that's why we at the center really feel like unpacking and better understanding what moral injury is and how to resolve it is one of the most important things that we can do for veterans and their families. So when we're looking at it then, in just to be able to understand that, again, people could have neither moral injury or PTSD after serving. They could have only moral injury without combat, fear and anxiety, PTSD. They could have just the PTSD without the moral injury, and they can have both. And so it's really important to approach every single veteran from that perspective. One of the things that's important is the cognitions or attributions about the event may not be distortions. Often with PTSD, it's distortions. With moral injury, it may not be so much so. And the hyperarousal and the visceral response is much more associated with the fear and anxiety-based PTSD than it would be moral injury. And I think this is a really important one, the function of the symptoms. And so a lot of times the isolation and everything you see with someone from severe fear and anxiety PTSD will be, they will avoid certain things that might trigger their response. And yet with moral injury, they may avoid interactions that where they fear social judgment of, and that it would exacerbate their own feelings of moral injury. So the similarities, obviously, they're both extremely stressful events that are unprecedented, prompts the psychological distress that is normal and natural. The re-experiencing is a part of it for both. Negative thoughts about self and others in the world are both, and the negative emotions, and feeling detached from others, even if the reason they feel detached are different. And I think it's important to know that moral injury, while it overlaps with PTSD, also doesn't come in a box by itself. It often can relate to depression, complicated grief, and trauma. There's a lot left to be understood about moral injury. And again, I'm going to leave this here, but I just want to say that the most important thing is a better, deeper dive understanding in the complexity and the nuances of moral injury, how it's experienced by veterans, and then how we would be able to provide more focused support and treatment for the specifics. One veteran I spoke to said, it's really difficult to be able to measure moral and study moral injury when I'm out in theater dodging bullets. But we have an opportunity and an obligation, he said, to study it right now, to do a deeper dive of understanding in the living laboratory what's going on for healthcare workers, for essential workers during COVID-19, to understand from the frontline level to the senior decision makers and leaders, and that what we learn in the nuances and unpacking of this may have and will have huge implications for our better understanding and serving veterans in the future. And so, again, I'm not going to talk too much about the moral stress with healthcare, other than to say we did partner with Phoenix, Australia, to do a rapid synthesis and the development of a brief guide, brief 22 pages, I think. So it outlines what we can be doing at the individual level, team level, and organization level. And what I want to leave us with is, I think one of the biases in approaching PTSD and moral injury, when you look at the research that has been done, it's understanding what are the individual differences that might contribute to someone being more at risk for PTSD or for moral injury. What we know from the healthcare context is, yes, we want individual healthcare workers to have access to self-care information and stuff that'll help them. But the bigger bang for our buck, and where we're going to have the most traction, and where there's more of an obligation for us, is what are the organizations who or the workplaces doing to support their workers. So taking it from a little bit, so one of the downsides of only focusing on individual factors is it can quickly become victim blaming and not look at the context that is creating the environment that can create either, like I said, exacerbate or mitigate PTSD or moral injury. Without further ado, I am going to turn it over to Brian McKenna to talk about it from his perspective and his own lived experience. And again, from our perspective, this is the expertise that we need to better understand.
So thanks, Patrick. And I'm going to introduce myself. I'm retired Warrant Officer Brian McKenna. I'm fortunate enough these days, I work at the Center of Excellence, and I'm the strategic advisor for veterans. And I've got this moment here. I'm going to just speak to you guys about a mission actually from 20 years ago. And this was a time that I found myself in Bosnia, 21-year-old kid. As we were preparing this briefing, looked at some of the maps. I've actually got a picture of it back over here. You can't see it well, but that's a reference for me, is just to have a look at it that way. That's how I'm used to speaking to people. I'm used to briefing on what we're going to do and where we're driving and how long it's going to take. So this is an interesting way of doing things now. I'm going to frame the situation for you a little bit, and then that'll allow me to move away from the details of it and talk to you about what I'm actually here to speak about, which is how it all felt. And so to get there, I just want to talk about a time where the war was over. This was 2000, year 2000. The Dayton Peace Accord was 5 years behind us. The Bosnia War was finished. And we were there on a peacekeeping mission. And if you could think of perhaps the Canadian context, we're looking at a country the size of New Brunswick. And then if you're going to think about where the Canadian portion of that was, it was a cigar-shaped piece of land on the upper left side touching the Croatian border. And within that, we had 1,800 Canadian soldiers dispersed over an area about the size of Cape Breton, but squished and long. So if you think about what it takes to police something the size of, say, Toronto to Kingston, you would think there would be thousands of police officers there. Well, now, if you look at it from the 1,800 soldiers, we're pretty dispersed and pretty spread out. And so one of the things to remember is, as I talk about going to a town called Bosanski Petrovac, which was about 2 hours of a drive away from where we were based in Bihać, think about us being there with 14 people in the back of 2 vehicles, and that's how far we were away from the nearest person that could support us. That's part of the frame too, is to understand what we have and what we don't have, and how isolated you can feel when you're off doing the business. Because that's quite often part of the story. Many times in my military career, I would have an incident happen on a base that had thousands of people. Completely different feeling than having 2 cars 2 hours away from the nearest help. So just a little bit more of the frame. We're in an area called the Bihać Pocket, Bihać being a town. And this was one of the few towns that the Muslim forces were able to hold on to during the war. So as more things happened in that area to them, this was a natural place for them to find a little bit of comfort, was to go there. And so while we were in Bosnia, Kosovo War was breaking out. Kosovar Albanians were abandoning the area. There were a lot of refugees. They were moving through our area, in fact, trying to break into the rest of Europe. As you can think about today, in fact, these places I speak of today are being used to house migrants from the current refugee situation that's happening in Europe. And so Croatia didn't want too much of that. So Croatia was enforcing its border. Kosovar refugees were moving up through Bosnia and getting jammed at that border, which was the area we were in. And so we had to make sure, as best we could, that people would protect that. So one day, we're going down to this town called Bosanski Petrovac. 10,000 Kosovar refugees are packed into this camp. And I can remember what the brims of the hats of the people in the vehicle look like. I can remember who was there that day and who was not. I can remember today, 20 years ago, who was having a bad attitude that day. I remember some of the off-color jokes that might have been told. I remember who was having arguments with their wife. Many days of that tour, I can't even put my finger on the map or a calendar and say that event happened on that day. But for a day like this, I can remember smells, sights. I can remember us breaking down for about 8 minutes. Those are the things that come back. So we're going down to this camp, and it's a refugee camp, and we're going down there to secure it as best we can. Along with that, I have to say this. Some people in the military as soldiers, they're parents themselves. I was not. I was a 21-year-old kid. For those that were parents, dealing with kids for them was a problem sometimes. For me, it was the other way around. For me, watching elderly people that were starving, elderly people that were under threat, was actually what was bothering me. And in Canada, a significant amount of my childhood was raised by my grandparents. Single parent family, we lived with them a lot. And so for me, watching old people rummage around for food was actually harder than watching the kids. As well, at that time, my grandfather, who I consider to be the father figure in my life, was going through heart trouble, and I'd volunteered to go on this mission knowing that he could die in the time that I'm going. So that was a really hard thing for me to square. And while having that in the back of my mind, watching old people suffer was a unique portion of it. Whole reason we were there, as I said earlier, was to prevent violence to these people. It wasn't to fix their lot in life. It wasn't to house them. We couldn't do that. We were a platoon of 34 soldiers based 2 hours away. We are now 14 guys in the back of 2 vehicles, monitoring to make sure that extreme violence is not happening to 10,000 people in the walls of the camp. That's what we could do. Specifically, and this is the root of my problem with this day, it was our policy not to feed people. We had some food for ourselves, but we could not do it. And the reasoning is simple. We couldn't feed thousands. If they started to see our camps as a source of food, the camps would be overrun. If they saw our vehicles as a source of food, the security situation of people trying to climb onto your vehicles is something that we just weren't going to set up. The other thing was, one of the reasons we were in Bosnia in the first place was to get the aid agencies to do aid agency things, to get the Bosnian government to start looking after its own people. So we could not start doing their job for them. And if we did, we would have a security and humanitarian nightmare the next day as the word got out that we were feeding people. So we couldn't. So this particular day, I have my box lunch. It's a cardboard, brown cardboard box. The writing in it, on the top of it, is in obviously French and English. The writing's in red. I remember opening it. The juice was on the left. Cookies were up on the right, sandwich and celery in there. And this particular moment, I just happened to be grabbing a bite to eat. And we come around a part of the camp where a big garbage pile is. And I remember watching old people crawling on that, looking for food, trying to pull some parts of, try to see if they could find, wood or plastic or blankets or anything that could work. And so we're not supposed to feed people, but we start. And I would hand some of the things I had off to people that would be by the vehicle. It's breaking the rule a little bit, but it was what happened. And as we were about to leave, all I had left was my juice box. And so there was an old man at the bottom of the pile poking around through it. So I threw it at him, and it hit the ground and then bounced and hit him. And he thought, the look on his face told me that he thought I was disrespecting, and I was throwing garbage at him, which obviously I wasn't doing, and he didn't know that. So he turned around and gave me a bit of a gesture, which would be the same as a middle finger in our country. And then he stomped on it. And as he did that, all the juice squirted out. And right then he realized I was not throwing garbage at him. I was trying to help him. And you could see the look on his face change from one of insult to one of regret, realizing that I was trying to do a good thing. And we didn't have anything else. So that was literally what happened. We drove away. There was nothing else for me to do. According to the patrol report, that went well. That day is a success because we were there to make sure no one was causing extreme violence to 10,000 people. As I feel about it now, it was a complete failure because I'm a human being, so are they. And since when is feeding people wrong? It's in that it took me years to figure out what actually bothered me about that. I can think of him tearing up as I'm driving away. It was a Croatian war, then the Bosnian one, and Kosovar one. The mines in the ground were in the millions, the weapons in people's houses. I mean, we kept collecting them, and there was no end in sight of them. The risk was everywhere, but that's not what I'm left with now. 20 years later, the AK-47s and the landmines are just part of it. I struggle still today with whether it was actually right to not feed people. I wonder if we could have done it different. We also knew, while we wanted the government to do its job, we also knew it wasn't going to do its job. So I do wonder if pushing them towards that incapable government was truly the right thing to do. Did we not, at some level, know better? I just know I didn't like to look at the face of hungry old men. I didn't like the look of no hope. A lot of these people had walked for hundreds of kilometers and now couldn't walk anymore. And so while they've abandoned their home, they now have to abandon the dream of breaking into Europe. And they're now stuck here. There's nothing better for them than that. That is, I guess I'll leave it at that. I'll add this, though, to go back to the frame of the situation. There's a tactical side to this, too. We wouldn't feed them, but the terrorist organizations would feed them at times. And so we found ourselves in a situation where our rules, not only did they hinder what we could do, it actually set up a situation for the belligerent groups that were there to come in, look like the good guy, and come in and save the day. So today we would call that a Hearts and Minds campaign. The local belligerent groups, terrorist groups, they had a better Hearts and Minds campaign than us. What it felt like is that we had rules that were ill-suited to the environment. And so while I'm in an armored vehicle with 2 machine guns on it and we're all armed, I felt exceptionally unarmed, disarmed really, by the rules that I had, while I was armed for a situation that I didn't have. I was armed for a violent situation. I found myself in a food one. And so that can create the situation where we feel like we're losing the war because the rules won't let us win. And so I'll end on this. In World War II, the country was at war. Hundreds of thousands of people went, but also food rationing, loose lip sink ships. The whole country realized it had to play its role in the war, even if that just meant keeping your lights off in the evening. One of the things I was very aware of was that the country was not in this war. It was just us. There was 1,800 Canadians, a couple thousand other NATO soldiers, and most of our family and friends were at the mall. Netflix wasn't a thing, but computer games were. And when I would be in these situations, checking in with my family and friends back home every now and then, they were not in the same frame of mind I was in. I was in a war zone that had starving people in it. And they were complaining that the bus was late or something had spilled on their favorite carpet. That was the war they were in. It was not the one I was in. So that's where I'm going to leave the story. The details actually don't matter all that much. What I want you to know is I left that day thinking that we didn't feed people that needed food. And I still struggle today with whether that was the right answer. And it's tough. It's tough to talk about it. It was tough to sit in front of my doctor for years and be as honest with him as he could, but I didn't know what was wrong with me. I didn't know what I was bothered about, so I actually couldn't tell him what I wanted him to help me fix. For a while, I thought it was about how bad certain situations went. Well, I can now tell you, having gone to worse conflict since then, that it's still that event that bothers me more. And so it's not a situation of risk or threat or body count for me. It's how I felt that day not being able to feed people that looked like my grandfather. I'll end it there. That gives me a little bit of a moment here to just come back to reality. I do have my map over on the wall. I've got my window out here to the right. I've learned over time that looking outside and reminding myself what I'm actually looking at, and as opposed to where my brain might feel it is one of the ways I can come out of those moments, and I can ground myself a little bit. Some people need to put their feet on the door, or on the floor, I should say. I need to look at something that's real, and generally something that's outside, and that's kind of what I'm doing right now. And then I'm going to hand over to one of our researchers, Stephanie Houle. We were mentioning earlier that she actually wrote a lot of this presentation. So she's going to take over from me, and I'm going to be here to answer some questions at the end. Thank you all.
All right, thank you, Brian. So I'm going to be speaking to you about recognizing moral injury and promoting moral healing. And just before I begin, I wanted to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from Ottawa, which is the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. So before I get into recognizing moral injury and promoting moral healing, and I think Brian's testimony probably did a lot to show us what this type of narrative looks like when we're having conversations with people about these experiences, I wanted to kind of remind you some things that we've already talked about to contextualize things a bit. So again, I think it's important to remember that moral injury is not necessarily well defined as a syndrome yet. So when we're talking about recognizing moral injury, what we're going to be talking about more so is recognizing the features of moral injury and how those might present kind of behaviorally and when we're speaking in conversation about these things as well. And so it's important to acknowledge as well that those features of moral injury like guilt and shame and anger and dissonance, these are things that are not unique to moral injury and that might actually be part of other syndromes like depression or just regular moral pain. So there is a risk of, pathologizing morally injurious experiences and the impact of those, because like Patrick mentioned, not all potentially morally injurious experiences are going to lead to moral injury, and we do want to recognize that moral pain and moral distress in relation to these experiences is often normative. So when we're talking about moral injury as well, I wanted to mention that because the core features are guilt and shame most prominently, like Patrick mentioned, there is a high likelihood that people who are struggling with these issues will tend to conceal and want to hide their experiences. And so I also just wanted to put in context that these are things that talking about them takes a lot of time, a lot of patience, tact, empathy. And actually, if we are too direct in asking about these things, that may actually prompt or exacerbate distress in individuals. So I just wanted to frame that. And also, as Brian mentioned, recognizing that the civilian context in which most of us work and live does operate within a different moral landscape than the moral landscape, the moral rules that people experience and live within during operations, and even in the military context as a culture. And so I think bringing to people, or having this in mind as we're having these conversations, is really important, just to frame things. We might not always understand people's actions, and we might have our own judgments about what was right, wrong, just, or unjust in those situations. And it's important to step back and be compassionate and understand those that kind of context as we try and have these conversations. So, like I mentioned, the features of moral injury likely prompt people to conceal their emotions and their experiences. So one of the indicators, or the ways that we can try and recognize moral injury, is by their behavioral features. So guilt and shame are emotions that lead to isolation and withdrawal. So that could be an indicator that someone might be experiencing moral pain and struggling with moral injury. People tend to not put as much meaning or purpose in their life. They tend to lose trust, like we mentioned. So lack of purposeful behavior, not doing things that were previously meaningful to them, for example, might be an indicator that someone is struggling with a moral injury. And then as guilt and shame are very prominent features of moral injury, so are anger and aggression. And of course, these are moral emotions that are directed outwards and towards other individuals, often by yelling or physical acts of aggression. These might also be behavioral indicators that someone is experiencing moral pain or moral injury. In terms of testimony and narratives and what you might hear in conversations about moral injury, I wanted to share with you some excerpts from interviews that I did in the context of my research with soldiers and veterans on the distress that they are living with as an experience, or as a result of potentially morally injurious experiences, just to give a bit of a voice to some of these things that we were talking about earlier. So I'll start by sharing this quote, which is to exemplify that sense of loss of trust that one can experience in the self in relation to these events. So this was a person who said, "I think my gut instinct is probably a big thing. I used to trust it. I used to know that, my gut would never lie to me. Now I question my own gut. I would avoid making decisions, actually avoid the decision that my gut was giving me. I would go the other way, which is not the right thing to do." So we hear in this narrative that the person used to trust that they could follow their gut, and after experiencing this experiences has kind of lost that sense of trust in their own gut instincts, in what they believe is the right thing to do. So I think, again, this just kind of brings a voice to that aspect of moral injury. This next one is in the context of spiritual dissonance, the disruptions in spirituality that can be prompted by morally injurious events. Here, in speaking about spirituality and God, this individual says, "I really have just gotten to the point where I just don't believe anymore. I really don't. I don't know. I don't even know if it'll change. Like, I'm in a good place with it now and I'm comfortable believing that. But at the same time, I don't want to believe it." So here again, kind of that dissonance, the not knowing, the doubting oneself and their spirituality kind of comes through in this excerpt. One thing that Patrick perhaps didn't touch on, because it's something that we identified in a study that we did here in Ottawa, is a consequence of moral injury being changes in a person's moral attitudes, their attitude towards what is moral and how they deal with moral situations. Was something, again, in the interviews that I did here in Ottawa, that we saw as being rather prominent, and there were some different patterns that we observed there. And these two quotes exemplify two of those. So the first one is rigidity, where individuals before the event might have been more comfortable with living in the gray and some ambiguity in their lives. And after the potentially morally injurious event, or the morally injurious event, tend to express things in more rigid black and white terms, as they tend to have a very strong view of what is right, what is wrong after this. So this is exemplified in this soldier saying, "Well, I've always known the difference between right and wrong, but the line just got thicker between the two." So again, that sense that things are more rigid now in terms of what is right and what is wrong. And then the second pattern that I'd like to exemplify here is that of disillusionment or pessimism. People having a gloomier or a more negative view on life and their attitude towards life after having experienced a potentially morally injurious event. So this person says, so I think I have a gloomier outlook. I'm not going to say on life, but on mankind as a whole. It changed your perspective. So again, these are maybe indicators as we're having conversations that might clue us in to the fact that a morally injurious event might have occurred. And this last one is, again, something that we identified in the study that I did here in Ottawa, which was that we observed soldiers and veterans in their narratives tended to have an increased reactivity and sensitivity to moral situations, and that they would apply a moral lens to situations that might not have been prone to moral judgment beforehand. Smaller scales events like being cut off in traffic, and as this person says, being late to an appointment. So this person says, do what is right. That's really the only standard. Now it goes to the more subtle things, like it's your job to show up on time. It's rude to be late for an appointment. I'm majoring in the minor, if you will, whereas before, meh, whatever. So this person acknowledges that they have kind of a moral lens to these more subtle, mundane experiences than they perhaps did before, and a stronger emotional reaction to those as well. And that's something that we saw in our data. So those quotes were really just to kind of, again, bring a voice to some of the things that we've been speaking of, and again, hopefully will help clue you into what you might want to listen for in having conversations about these types of experiences with individuals. And now I want to talk about, just again, contextualizing things, because I think it is so important in terms of how we can foster positive conversations and healing. So I think in terms of creating a safe space to discuss moral injury, again, one of the best things we can do is acknowledge the morally difficult nature of military service in order to encourage conversations, and acknowledge that I understand that I live in a different moral world than you did overseas, and I'm open to talking about that. Having patience and compassion, like we talked about, these are events that lead to very strong feelings of guilt and shame, which have an action tendency of concealment, not wanting to talk about it. So it is important to be patient, compassionate, and going at the pace of the person and what they're willing to discuss and share, and letting them know that they can divulge as much or as little as they want, can go at their own pace, and that you'll be there to listen when they're ready to speak. And then promoting self-care, meaning making, social connection being so important, especially I think when we're talking about loss of trust as being such a significant component of moral injury. Having positive social connections and interactions can be very important. And of course, non-judgment, like I mentioned earlier, acknowledging that we might have a different view on a situation, but important to not put that on the people that we're speaking to. So these are some questions that are a bit more pointed then if you're trying to, perhaps in a more clinical context when you can be a little bit more direct, assess whether a person might have been exposed to a potentially morally injurious event, and what the consequences of that may be. And again, like I said, being too direct can prompt distress in some people. So these are questions meant to, if you really have a secure base and a trusting base and you want to try and understand more, and that's what we would see maybe in a more clinical context. So you could ask questions about the event. Did you ever experience an event that was a serious challenge to your sense of who you are, your sense of the world, your sense of right and wrong? When you thought that others failed to fulfill a responsibility or duty, where you felt betrayed by others, where you betrayed others, where you witnessed other people act in ways that violated your moral code? So as you can see, all these questions are meant to touch on all those different types of potentially morally injurious experiences that Patrick mentioned, and the ways that those can occur. Acts of commission versus omission, acts being perpetrated by the self versus those by others, betrayal. So this list of questions, I think, is comprehensive in being able to tap into those different areas of the event. And again, it's important to understand that there is no clear-cut definition of what a potentially morally injurious event is, and it's the person's perception of their own values that has been violated that is important in understanding their experience. In terms of the impact and trying to understand and assess moral injury and the consequences, you could ask, how do you feel now when you think about the event? Are you preoccupied by the event? Does it take a lot of space in your day? Have you noticed changes in relationships? Any changes in your view of yourself or the world? Changes in spirituality? of what's meaningful to you and your abilities to trust. So these are kind of more neutral questions aimed at trying to uncover what the consequence of PMIEs or potentially morally injurious experiences are for individuals. There are also several questionnaires that have been developed to assess moral injury. Again, because this is a new field, these questionnaires that exist are kind of fraught with some problems. They've been criticized for example, confounding moral distress with exposure to events. But again, just so that you know that these are out there, this is the best of what we have right now if you are looking for kind of tools like questionnaires in the work that you're doing. And also, in response to there not being a well-validated measure, we at the Center, in collaboration with the Moral Injury Outcome Study Consortium, which our aim is to internationally validate a scale of moral injury as an outcome. So that work is in progress. And one of the strengths of this scale that we're developing is that those interviews that I shared testimony with you before, it's the testimony of soldiers and clinicians who work with veterans that have been used to develop the items for this scale. So in terms of validity, we believe that this is actually going to serve to strengthen the scale. So just let you know that that work's in progress as well. So now let's talk about moral healing. So again, because moral injury isn't a defined syndrome, we don't have any evidence-based indicated treatments for it, but there are a lot of really good suggestions out there for how we can help mitigate moral distress and heal. And here are some of the common elements of those approaches. So first being acceptance, like we talked about, that dissonance that occurs within the individual, not being able to come to terms with the moral pain and the event as being a prominent feature of moral injury, that lack of resolution can be approached with acceptance and encouraging people to accept the reality of the events as well as the moral pain that they're experiencing. In terms of lack of trust, anger, guilt and shame, forgiveness can be a really strong aspect of healing. Forgiveness of the self as well as forgiveness of others. And meaning making, and trying to encourage individuals to think about, how does facing this event and what it means for me, how can I take that and make something meaningful of it? Are there values there that I understand to be meaningful to me? And even if I violated them in the past or I saw them being violated, can I live in congruence with those values in the present moment, moving forward in life? Self-compassion as well as being open to understanding that moral pain is just one part of being human, and awareness of a sense of self that is distinct from moral pain. Is I might have done this thing or witnessed this thing and I experience moral pain from it, but that is not all of me. It does not define me, and there are other elements of myself that I should be compassionate for. And then this last one I think is actually the most important one, like we talked about, is the therapeutic or the social relationship in which you're trying to have these conversations, creating an atmosphere of acceptance and non-condemnation. Lack of trust is a very prominent feature of moral injury. And like I said, it takes patience and it takes time, but rebuilding trust in this way in relationships can be a really strong aspect of moral healing. So this slide is just to let you know that even though there's only preliminary evidence, there are some treatments that have preliminary evidence of efficacy for treating moral injury or the distress that we call moral injury. So acceptance and commitment therapy, which is a third wave CBT approach by Stephen Hayes and colleagues that focuses on those elements like I talked about, living with one's values, acceptance of moral pain. There's some preliminary research on that. Adaptive disclosure is a protocol developed by Brett Litz and colleagues in Boston, again taking a CBT approach to facilitating disclosure of the events and meaning making within that process. The impact of killing in war is a supplemental 6 to 8 session module that's meant to supplement CBT for trauma, and it focuses on the impact of killing and the meaning of killing and the moral pain that causes, and being able to heal from that very specifically. And I think that the trials of this have been done in a group setting, which I think also helps facilitate that sense of shared experience that's really important. As Patrick mentioned, prolonged exposure therapy is a long-time evidence-based treatment for PTSD, and there is some debate in the literature as to whether or not this can be effective for treating moral injury, the criticism being that it risks bringing up and strengthening those feelings of guilt and shame, and then other people saying, well, if there is a traumatic aspect to the situation, being able to debrief and talk about all of those fearful and guilt and shame elements of the event can actually lead to healing. Cognitive processing therapy is another evidence-based treatment for PTSD that focuses on challenging erroneous cognition surrounding the traumatic event. And so it's been criticized for, again, maybe not all cognitions in moral injury are erroneous. There is something bad that happened. I should not have done that, and I did. And challenging that might not be useful. But the more recent iterations of this manual take into account emotions like guilt and shame and anger in a little more detail. And there's this spiritually oriented CBT kind of add-on module for individuals with spiritual distress. There's kind of a religious branch of it and a more non-religious, spiritually oriented branch aimed at helping heal through forgiveness and maybe more spiritual rituals as well, if that's something that would fit for your client or the person that you're working with. And there are other treatments that I'll mention that don't have very strong support, but I think it's as important to look at and understand, what doesn't work as what does work. So those are there, and there's a reference there as well if you'd like to know more. So with that, I will conclude and thank you for your time and pass it back over to Dr. Dell.
Hi. Oh, wow. That was amazing. Thank you, Stephanie and Brian and Patrick. That was so full of information. We'll go into questions now. We have, it looks like 15 minutes to do that. And I believe we have a question already. There are questions in French. Stephanie will be able to answer these. And also, I just want to remind people about the resources at the first slide that we had there. If you would like those resources, everything's on servicedogsresearch.ca. So all the slides are up already. So all of them are there, or send Mary Ellen an email because I know that's how you got access to this. Okay, so our first question I see here already from Sabrina is, thank you for the presentation again. I'm wondering if any research has been performed on moral injury and international development humanitarian aid workers. I find this very relevant and applicable. So maybe Patrick, if you would be able to answer that one.
I'm also going to rely on Steph if she knows any of the specific research. But what I can say is recently we have been in discussions with the United Nations World Food Program, and they've articulated needing to support. It's a mental health in the workplace program for them, but their workers are scattered around very different countries with very different cultures, often a different culture than what the individual themselves is coming from. And so they've talked about the concept of moral injury and just a way to support their workers. That's not research-based, but that is just acknowledging that they experience it. And so they've reached out to Dr. Kim Crace and myself at the Royal just to talk about ways that we might be able to support them with materials. And from Dr. Crace's perspective, some kind of a frontline wellness specifically targeted to their cultural environmental work that they're doing, often many of them in war zones themselves. And so I can definitely see the applicability, and I'm going to turn it to Steph to see if there's any specific research that's been done on that you know of.
Yeah, to my knowledge, there have been a couple, and there's definitely a consensus in the literature that this is applicable to the humanitarian work situation. Anecdotally, I'm aware of a small group of researchers led by Pascal Briand at UQAM, Université de Québec à Montréal, who's interested in this work and is going to be, I think, doing more of this. So I think that we're definitely going to see more of this to come shortly.
Thank you both. Nancy Poole is asking, what do we see as the benefits of more trauma-informed approaches, not only therapeutic ones? Maybe Stephanie?
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, sorry. What do we see as the benefits of more trauma-informed approaches, not only therapeutic ones?
Well, I think we still have a lot of research to do to understand what, like Patrick mentioned, in a lot of cases, there's PTSD and moral injury. So the first point of understanding a person's experience and what's going to be most helpful for their healing in trauma is to understand the qualities of those events. So in terms of the benefits versus harms, I guess, of those different approaches, I think there's still a lot of work to be done on that. I'm not sure I can say much more.
I think I can maybe jump in also to add that that's really when Colleen, and back in the day when we were working on the National Addiction Treatment Strategy, and Nancy Poole, the questioner, was also on that group with us. And so when we talk about, it's not just clinical treatment, it's a system of services and supports across different sectors. And I think the more that we can equip and raise the bar for trauma-informed system of services and supports, the better. And that's why for us, one of our key priority areas is peer support organizations. You know, often when there are gaps in the system, necessity being the mother of invention, helping veterans and family members helping family members is a significant part of the world of supporting our veterans and family. So even our work around the mapping a tiered model of peer support and having those peer workers tell us what kinds of supports and training do they want. And what we've heard a lot about is just generally helping them have a better sense of trauma, being trauma informed in ways that can support all the people that they're working with. So I think, to Nancy's point, it's a general across the board raising awareness of trauma informed services and understanding that the trauma can be on the fear and anxiety part or the guilt and shame. And Brian may have something to add to that.
I think for me, part of what makes the stress of going overseas and handling morally injurious events, one of the things that makes it difficult is even on a more basic level, you can sometimes get the feeling that your country's not necessarily there with you. I guess I'll put it this way. If you take any mission around the globe right now, it's already going to be a contentious issue just because it is a military mission. That's always going to bring out a political viewpoint. And so you come back to your country where just getting off the plane, you feel like you're surrounded by 50-60% of people that don't even think you should be there in the first place. That in itself makes broaching the conversation of something happened there that I'm not all that proud of so much harder to have. And that's, I guess I would leave it there for me.
Thank you all. I just want to say, Nancy commented, she said she totally agrees with you, Patrick, that some of the approaches like acceptance, meaning making, etc., are all a part of a trauma-informed approach. And I know all of our panelists are aware of that, so thank you. There is a question from Camelia, and she's saying, I'm wondering if the panelists would be willing to comment about the spiritual dimension of moral injury. What does research and experience say about that? Does the shock of moral injury shake the spiritual value systems one has? And I remember when I first came to U of S, we started to look at spirituality in terms of addiction, and that's a hard question. We did that for about 6 months in measuring that, and then I slowly stepped away, right? This is a really important question. Maybe this is one we could end on, and everyone can kind of touch on this one a little bit.
Well, and excellent question. And I would think that one of the things that we hear about is everyone talks about biopsychosocial spiritual, but often, as Brian Rushford used to say, biopsychosocial spiritual. And we haven't been focusing as much on the spiritual. I think if you look to some of the key moral injury researchers in Canada, like Dr. Suzette Bromont-Phillips or Dr. Lorraine Smith-McDonald, in Saskatchewan, Alberta, sorry, Matt Highmark, they've done some of the specific work on the role of spirituality in moral injury. But what we know anecdotally when we talk to anyone, and this again goes back to my opening when you talk to, when you look at the Thunderbird partnerships, mental wellness framework and hope, purpose, meaning, and belonging. Every single veteran I've spoken to that has had a journey and gotten to the other side of their PTSD and or moral injury has talked about the role of renewed sense of identity and purpose. And there's so much spirituality ingrained in that. And so I think it's something that we're going to have to lean into.
Great. Yeah, Brian.
I would say as well, even if someone, before they get into situations that are morally injurious, even if they don't look at themselves from necessarily a spiritual background, they probably have some faith in humanity or some degree of belief out there that, you know, what do good people do in general, and aren't most of us that way? And then I was particularly struck when I was in Yugoslavia that I was a 4-hour train ride away from Vienna. Like, I could fly to Rome in a half hour. How am I that close to these places that are so good, and yet I'm right around their backyard and it's so bad? You know, and it's almost, it challenges your sense of in other people, like, how can you not know this is here? And then when you know it's here, why aren't we doing something more aggressive about it?
Yeah. Thank you. Stephanie, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I think the concept of moral injury and the research interest around it, the clinical interest around it, community interest around it has been so important in bringing to light the importance of spiritual and existential issues in mental health, and also the need to have an integrated treatment approach where that takes this into account. Spiritual leaders and chaplains, especially in the military context, how conversations need to be facilitated, and perhaps more training for clinicians needs to be incorporated into understanding these problems. And also, if there are, the spiritual distress that arises from moral injury, how important it is to take a community approach to healing as well, especially if someone identifies strongly with a certain denomination or religion or community, that is a real strength of spiritual and religious communities, is being able to see people through difficult times like this. And I think we need to rely on that and have open conversations from all these different sectors in order to approach the moral healing that should occur with moral injury.
Yeah. I'm just going to end it up here with Brian with one final question, because I'm going to bring it back to the service dogs. And I'm just wondering, I know that you had a service dog, and I know we're talking here about hope, belonging, meaning, and purpose, which is awesome. Did your service dog help with your moral injury? And if so, how?
Well, one of the problems for all injury that I was going through was just sitting there and stewing in it. I spent a significant amount of time not getting off my couch, not getting outside. And if you would follow my path of getting healthier, I mean, I think I'm not 100% healthy now. I mean, I don't think that's ever a perfectly achievable idea, but I'm certainly a lot healthier than I was. And I would say, whether it was from traumatic events or morally injurious events, getting outside was one of the best things that I did. Having an animal that depended on me, it wasn't so much what I was getting out of the dog, it was having someone that needed me to function. Getting my house in order, getting my vehicle in order, those were all things that were critical. And, you know, to get a dog to pass any provincial handling test or public access test is a feat in itself. It is a challenge, and you got to work at it. So when you get there, you get this, it was kind of like the first feeling of accomplishment I ever had after getting back from going overseas, was getting that dog and me to pass that test. It's work, and you got somewhere. And next thing you know, when you look back at the last, half a year of your life, like, okay, I'm getting fitter again, I'm getting outside. So for me, the health that came from a dog, I don't have the ability to tell you which of the categories it helped me with. But 3 years ago, I was told I'd never work again.
That's wonderful. I'm going to end it there. It was a wonderful ending. I want to thank you, Brian, Patrick, and Stephanie again on behalf of everyone for all the effort you put into this and all the work that you're doing to share this important story. And I love that the center is focused on research and evidence-based practice, but you're putting that in the hands, as you say in your mandate, of those who could use it. So thank you again. Everyone's going to get a really short evaluation. Yeah, and with that, on behalf of myself and EJ here and our whole team, thank you everyone and thank you for attending. Bye.
Thank you.